Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour aussi aux gens à l'Université McGill et à l'Université Laval. Donc, je suis Danielle Gauvreau, directrice académique du ciqss, et j'ai le plaisir aujourd'hui de souhaiter la bienvenue à Phillip Connor. Donc, il va nous présenter un séminaire sur le thème Immigrant Religion in Canada, Disruption, Adaptation and Facilitation. Phillip Connor a complété une maîtrise en sociologie à l'Université McGill et un doctorat en sociologie également à l'Université Princeton. Je parle en français parce qu'il comprend très bien le français, donc ça ne pose pas de problème. Donc, nous sommes très heureux de l'avoir avec nous aujourd'hui. Le séminaire est présenté conjointement en collaboration avec le CETUM, le Centre d'études ethniques des universités montréalaises. Donc, il nous fait plaisir d'avoir parmi nous Phillip Connor aujourd'hui pour faire cette présentation.
Okay, I think everyone can hear me out there and see me, I hope. Okay. It is great to be here. I do understand French, so at the end, if you want to ask your questions in French, I'm happy to receive them. I just won't answer in French. Statistics in French is a little different for me, so I'm not used to thinking it that way. But I am able to take questions in French afterwards. I do work at the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life. The Pew Research Center may not be familiar to most people. Essentially, it is a research fact tank, not a think tank. We present facts, not thoughts, I suppose. But we present facts, usually more quantitatively based, demographics, a lot of polling we do, political polling, and so forth. It is a nonprofit organization funded mainly from the Pew Charitable Trusts, although we also work with other funding agencies to provide the research that we do there. The Pew Research Center is about 130 employees in Washington, D.C. That ranges of projects, a variety of backgrounds, including the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which I'm part of, as well as the Pew Hispanic Center, the Global Attitudes Project, and a few others. And so it's quite an extensive operation. And although certainly in the past there's been a lot of emphasis on domestic American issues, now we are certainly going more global. And in all of our research, we're presenting more global findings. The connection with me to being here is the fact that when I was doing my master's at McGill and also my doctorate in Princeton, I was continually up here at the lab working on the longitudinal survey of immigrants of Canada, working on my own dissertation project. And so some of the findings that I'm presenting today come through that research. But I'll also be adding towards the end some additional research that I've done since being at Pew with another colleague, Matthias Koenig, who is a professor at University of Göttingen in Germany. So I'll be kind of presenting actually 3 papers in one today. Now, I know that sounds scary to those that are sitting there because you think I'm going to go on and on. But I will be short on methodological things, more focusing on the findings and what kind of things they have to say to us today. So without further ado, let's move forward to the actual presentation. I present a few photos here to kind of bring to life some of the issues that have been faced in Canada, and specifically in the province of Quebec most recently. It does seem that every 6 months or even to a year interval, there's some kind of incident that comes up into the media that has to deal with immigrant religion. And here are just a few photos that kind of help to bring to memory some of those instances that happened perhaps a few years ago. These are a bit dated. I know there's been more recent ones. And so we can remember the young Sikh man who took his ceremonial dagger to school many years ago and went through the Supreme Court to find if he had the right to actually take that to school. We also have the events at Hérouville, which are a few years back now, but still probably very much in our memory. Also, I remember when I was a student at McGill, we had the removal of the prayer space for the Muslim Student Association there at the time as well. So there's certainly the issue of immigrant religion is very much in the media, and of course it came to a point where we actually had the report, the Bouchard-Taylor report, which came out looking at reasonable accommodation and so forth. So this is very a timely kind of matter in Canada, particularly in the province of Quebec. And so, but as we kind of look at all these instances that have happened in the media and in life here in this province and in the country, we still kind of are grappling with this question of how do immigrants religiously adapt to Canadian society. There are a lot of ideas out there. There's been a lot of excellent research, and I'm trying to build off that excellent research, but rarely has there been kind of a quantitative or statistical look at some very unique questions on this particular topic. And so that's what I'm going to attempt to address today. Now, if we look at what has been done, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, on the topic of immigrant religion, there's kind of three streams that have happened. The first are put together by sociologists of religion, who have essentially looked mainly at particular religious congregations, looked at particular religious groups in a given city, sometimes comparing between cities or at times between countries, to be able to get at kind of what's happening within religious congregations. And this, although it's been a great start to understanding of how immigrant religious groups of different backgrounds are interacting with each other, and also how it's assisting their integration into the societies that they're living in, they do offer kind of this more ethnographic background, and have yet to really get into kind of a quantitative look that's more representative of a grander population of immigrants. So that's one stream that has happened. Another stream that you're probably very well aware of is kind of more on the political science, political theorist stream, in which we have ideas about how the state, religion, and immigrant integration are working with each other. Often this is in a comparative frame, looking at the issue of multiculturalism, but very much driven from a more theoretical perspective. At times there are some very great empirical evidence, however, it doesn't really always get into the details that we may be looking for at all times. And then we have the migration experts, or sociologists of migration, demographers, who have only recently started looking at the issue of religion. In fact, if I were to kind of call up the Handbook of International Migration, which deals with the U.S., there wasn't even one chapter devoted to religion in it at that time. It was published about 10 years ago. Destination Canada, which is often a text that's actually given in many undergraduate and graduate courses about immigration in Canada, also doesn't have much detail on religion per se. But only recently have migration scholars actually been going to look at the topic of religion on a global scale. So what I am trying to identify here today are kind of 3 points or 3 moments in a migration life stage, if you will, of how immigrants are religiously adapting to Canadian society. I'll be looking at the themes of disruption, adaptation, and facilitation. And so more specifically, I'll be looking at how does the immigrant religious participation change from country of origin to country of destination? Is there any change in that kind of movement, that migration activity? Secondly, I'll be looking how do immigrants religiously adapt in their religious participation rates once they come to the new society or come to the receiving society. That's the adaptation piece. And then the final piece is to look at religion as an independent variable and be able to see how that is either assisting or perhaps not assisting their greater incorporation into society. Now, I must state that as we go forward in some of these findings, we really only have in many of these data sets 2 variables to rely on, more or less. We have some kind of variable that looks at religious identification. What is your religion? Are you religiously affiliated with any group, or are you Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, and so forth? The other variable that we often look at is some kind of religious participation rate, as to how frequently they attend any kind of religious organization. And so these are the kind of 2 variables that we're kind of clinging to today to look at a variety of analyses. I wish there were always more to look at different forms of religious activity, both private and public. But unfortunately, this is what we're kind of left with at the moment when we look at broad immigrant populations as a whole. So let's first look at how religion and the migratory event operates. The key question here is, does immigrant religious participation increase or decrease after migration? And actually, in the literature, there is actually 2 kind of counter-hypotheses here. One is the idea that the idea of moving to a new place is actually a very theological experience. There's many theological texts that actually look at this, and that's a very spiritual experience. And in that way, people have found that religious consciousness actually rises following migration, that people are more open to living their faith, particularly those of minority groups in which perhaps their religion was kind of taken for granted in their country of origin, but now they've become a minority. The counter-hypothesis is that, no, actually, the migratory event is very disruptive. In fact, on a variety of levels. We know that fertility is disrupted when people migrate. Their economic capacity is disrupted as well. And so we would expect perhaps that religion as well would be somewhat disrupted through this kind of migratory event. It's a very significant event in people's lives. And so the counter hypothesis would be that religious activity actually declines following migration. And so I wanted to look at this with the data that we had, and I'm recalling here a survey that's actually quite old now, but has been used quite frequently, I know, in this lab, the Enquête sur l'établissement des nouveaux immigrants. These were immigrants that are admitted to Quebec in June through November 1989, about 1,000 in the survey, and they were interviewed 1, 2, 3, and 10 years after migrating to Quebec. Unfortunately, the 10-year religious participation variable was unavailable for this. There was some coding issues there that were problematic. So we're only be looking at the first, second, and third waves. Here, the variables that I'm looking at are the dependent variable is monthly or more frequent religious participation. I collapsed that into a binary variable, as I consistently do for the rest of this presentation today. And then with independent variables, just looking at the post-migration experience and subsequent years. So what's interesting is the fact that they did ask each individual to recall their level of religious participation in their country of origin. So it's a retrospective measure, self-evaluated by the individual respondent. And then we have control variables that I'm including here, and we'll be using logistic regression pool time series to look at this particular question. And so here are some predicted probabilities for active religious participation of monthly and more among immigrants to Quebec in 1989 by religion and year. The blue columns indicate their levels of religious participation prior to migration, as reported by the actual respondent. The green represents 1 year after migration. That was basically the first wave of the survey. And then the gray represents 3 years after migration. When we look here at the full sample, all of these differences are significant. We can see about 60% of the actual population of immigrants to Quebec in the early 90s stated they were a 60% probability of being involved in a religious organization monthly or more. But that drops to around a 50% probability come 1 year after the migration experience itself. The question would be, does it rebound, though? But it does not. I find that only it's a 30% probability of active religious participation 3 years out after migration. And then if we're actually able to look at this across religious groups, we see a similar, somewhat different pattern, but mostly similar. Catholic, we see that same decline that occurs after migration and for future years, as well as all other religions besides Catholics and Protestants. Protestants are a bit different in this respect. The differences between years were not significant and remain quite stable, it appears. But as a whole, this could be the result of the fact that Protestants is actually a small group of N within here, so the statistical significance can be altered. But as a whole, we do see this kind of disruption or decline amongst most religious groups of immigrants to Quebec. Now, I think at this point, it's kind of important to realize that as we look at Canada, the province of Quebec itself, it's important to kind of see if these kind of patterns are similar or unique to this context. And so a lot of my greater research actually is comparative in looking at the United States and Europe, and to be able to see if some of the things we find in Canada are unique or perhaps different from those two different contexts. As I move forward through the presentation, I'll be continually giving reference to the American and European experience as to provide us some kind of level of comparison to see where Canada kind of places itself on immigrant religious adaptation. And what I wanted to do here is to draw on another survey here to see again if these results are unique. These are the predicted probabilities for monthly or more religious participation among immigrants to the U.S. in 2003. A very similar survey was conducted in 2003 called the New Immigrant Survey of the new immigrants receiving their permanent residency in 2003. They were also asked of their pre-migration levels of religious participation retrospectively. And then they were asked about 6 months to 1 year later after migrating what their levels of religious participation were. Again, these are predicted probabilities controlling for the same factors that I listed for there earlier. And here by religious group, we can see that basically there is this drop in religious participation following migration in the U.S. as well. some may counter the fact that Quebec is a very secular society compared to the United States, and this would explain why we'd have this drop. But in fact, we see this drop also occurring within the United States. This seems to be a general pattern of a migration disruption on religious participation from country of origin to country of destination. This particular survey will also do a second wave, or they have done a second wave. The data is becoming available only now, so we will see if there's some kind of rebound later on. But I present this as to provide kind of a greater context to the fact that this appears to be a general disruption pattern in immigrant religious participation. And I do want to note again that this is organizational kind of religious activity. This does not identify kind of the self-rated religiosity that someone might feel that they're more religious after they've migrated or not, or religious identity per se, but actually religious participation in an organization. That kind of puts off the disruption side of what I wanted to look at the change between country of origin to country of destination. The next piece I wanted to look at was adaptation more generally. And here I'm looking at religious attendance or religious participation as, again, the dependent variable. I'm trying to see here, essentially, do immigrants assimilate their religious participation patterns to those found in the native-born society? In other words, in places where where the native-born population is more religious, are immigrants also becoming more religious in those places? In places where the native-born population is less religious, are immigrants also becoming less religious? We know that this is a matter of patterns for other outcomes, like health. We know that places where immigrants are healthier, actually in places where there is a healthier native-born population. They are adapting, or if we want to use kind of an older term, assimilating in the analytical sense to the population that they are living in. Now, there's lots of theory that deals with adaptation and assimilation theory. Certainly, there's been this kind of 7-step process long ago, back in the 60s, that Gordon pointed to. But then, because of the normative nature of assimilation, it really was kind of tossed out as an element of inquiry. Only recently, assimilation theory has kind of come back into prominence, and mostly for more of its analytical sense. Does this see, not so much in the normative sense, but the analytical sense, are immigrants adjusting to the levels of the experience of the native-born population? And so I'm relying here on Brubaker's kind of concept of assimilation, as I state here on the PowerPoint. In the general abstract sense, the accent is on the process, not on some final state, and assimilation is a matter of degree. Assimilation designates a direction of change, not a particular degree of similarity. And so here we're trying to see if, over time, are immigrant religious participation rates becoming more similar to those in which the context that they are living in. There is already evidence of this in the United States, if I can draw on that for just a moment, on de facto congregationalism. This is the idea that even immigrant religious groups who are not used to operating in a congregational model, typically, a congregation, a Protestant congregation, because that's the kind of prominent type of religious group that's in the United States, even religious groups that don't operate in that kind of congregational organization ecology are often become congregationally looking. They look like congregations. They look like Protestant congregations, even though they may not be Protestant groups themselves. So there's already this identification that immigrant religious groups are already adapting in that sense. There is also evidence of internal migrants within the United States becoming more religious when they move to more religious areas, and less religious when they move to less religious areas. So I am building here on some theories that already exist. Now, to the data that I'll be using here, it's the longitudinal survey of immigrants to Canada, which some of you may be familiar with. I spent many hours in the lab working on this particular data set. These are immigrants to Canada that arrived in 2001 with permanent residency who applied for visas abroad, outside of Canada. There's 3 waves to the survey: 6 months, 2 years, and 4 years after migration. Unfortunately, the religious participation variable question was changed, the wording of it, in the final wave, and there was really some mismatches in the actual data, and so I'm not able to use that particular question at this time. I can get into that details later if you want to talk about it. So I'll be looking at just wave 1 and wave 2. I essentially divided the immigrant population, or the immigrant sample here, by their city of residence, their census metropolitan area. The reason for this, and not going to a smaller unit, which would perhaps be more desirable, is the fact that I also want to match each immigrant respondent to some kind of reliable measure of the native-born population religious participation. And going to a smaller unit would not allow me to do that with probability surveys. Where did I get that data from for the native-born population? I basically pooled together the Canadian General Social Surveys between 2001 and 2005 to get a mean level of religious participation of monthly or more for each CMA. And then compare that to the immigrant religious participation as stated in the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada. Just to kind of give you an idea, does Canada have this kind of intervariation of religious participation rates among the native-born? And to answer, they do. For example, it appears that the least religious, if I could use that term loosely, area of Canada is Victoria, where 22% of the population attends monthly or more a religious service, compared to Windsor, where it's 42% of the population. So we have a good 20-point spread here, which is really nice to be able to get some variation. And these are just a few of the cities that some of the larger ones, in fact, but there's 27 units altogether. So the variables we'll be looking at here, the dependent variable is from the immigrant survey, religious group participation, monthly or more at the individual level. And then the independent variable is that unit at the CMA of the religious participation rate for the general population, or I should say actually the native-born population, because you have to keep this in mind since some of these census metropolitan areas have 30, 40% immigrant. That could certainly contribute. So we want to look specifically at the native-born population. Control variables at the individual level, religious affiliation, meaning are they Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, so forth. Age, sex, spouse and residence, child in the residence, education, employment status, visa category. And then I also put in some contextual level variables that didn't really prove to have any interesting results. I would hope there would be something to talk about there, but there isn't. But nonetheless, they're there more as control variables, the proportion foreign-born, religious pluralism, and proportion religious affiliation for the given religious group that the immigrant states they are part of. And then my methods here are relying on multi-level modeling. There's two aspects of it. First, we're doing two-level models, taking into account country of birth, so taking into account those ethnic differences, as well as, secondly, CMA residence that they are in for the separate waves of 2001 and 2003. And then another multi-level modeling strategy of doing those same two levels but adding the individual level over the two time periods to be able to see, again, if we have any kind of correlation, keeping all these things into account for the levels of religious participation of the native-born on the immigrant population per se. And just after I show the results from the LSIC, I also, again, want to provide some comparisons to other research that I've done in the United States and Europe to see if we have a similar pattern, yes or no. So here's just a very descriptive, descriptive plot here looking at grouped means. So basically, on the y-axis, we have the immigrant population. This is just the group mean for all immigrants, no controls here, no predicted probabilities, by CMA of their religious participation rates, attending monthly or more. And then on the x-axis, we have the host population, again, from that pooled Canadian General Social Surveys. And we can see just by grouped means, there isn't much of a correlation. Somewhat, you can kind of see a line developing there, but this is only 6 months after migrants have entered the context, right? So we would not expect them to all of a sudden have changed the religious participation levels to match that of the native-born. There hasn't really been enough time. It's only 6 months. The correlation of just these grouped means, again, this is very crude, is just 0.25. But if I allow time to pass and allow the plot to interact over time to 2 years after the immigrants have arrived, we can see the line fixes in the direction that we would expect. Now there's a correlation of 0.53, and there's very much now a stronger relationship between these group means of the host society, native-born society, and the immigrant population. Always a few outliers, but again, there's no controls taken into account here. This is just, descriptive grouped means. Just want to kind of visually give you a sense before we get into seeing these multi-level coefficients, which don't give you as much a visual sense of what may be happening. And here are the kind of the table here. I do not include the control variables just for a matter of simplicity. On the LSIC to the right here, we'll look at the other two columns in a moment, looking at Europe and the United States. We can see here when I operate the multi-level models for country of birth and CMA residence for 2001 and 2003 waves separately. So I ran a separate equation for each of those waves. We can see in 2001 that there's no significant relationship between the host society religious participation and the immigrant religious participation, which is actually a bit of a comforting thing as a researcher, because if there was, then perhaps it's possible that immigrants are selecting their city of residence by the levels of religious participation that are occurring in that location, or that I just basically did something that was incorrect. So actually, this is what we would expect to happen only 6 months after migration. In 2003, we see there is actually a positive and significant, strongly significant relationship between the CMA level of religious participation of the host society and that of the immigrant population. These are multi-level models, and so what I wanted to do is actually make sure that when we take into account the individual level across the 2 time periods, that we still have this actual positive relationship, and significant it is as well. Now, when we look at this kind of experience of adaptation, in other words, immigrants that are in more religiously active areas are also more religiously active. Those that are in less religiously active areas are also less religiously active. I want to be able to see if this is, again, a uniquely Canadian experience. And so, drawing on greater data elsewhere, I drew on the European Social Survey and selected a subsample of immigrants, first-generation immigrants, foreign-born immigrants, in this particular survey, controlling for their country of birth, and actually looking at the sub-areas below their country of birth. And I do find a positive relationship in this cross-sectional survey. Okay, it's only a cross-sectional survey. So certainly the arrows could be going in the opposite direction, although we wouldn't really expect too much that the native-born society is adjusting too much to the immigrant levels of religious participation. But nonetheless, it could occur. In the NIS, the New Immigrant Survey in the United States, we also see at the state level a similar positive relationship. And so this seems to indicate to me the fact that immigrants are becoming, over time, at least from the very small time frame that we had to look at in the longitudinal survey of immigrants Canada, but yet in a short period of time, if you think of it, already adjusting to the levels of religious participation in their local societies. And I think that's what a bit important to keep in mind here, is that often we would think that there would be an adjustment at a national level, but perhaps not so much at local city levels. And that seems to be occurring, at least from the data that I have worked with. The final piece that I want to examine, I'm just going to check my time here to make sure I'm okay. Yes, doing okay, is facilitation. And here I want to look at religion as an independent variable on some kind of immigrant outcome for integration of immigrants. In other words, the question that's very simple here is, does religion help or hinder immigrants' integration into society? Now, there's a lot of ways we can measure immigrant integration. And I'm only going to look at one today, just to limit some time. I've looked at a few others, so if you have other questions, perhaps we can talk later. I want to focus in here on actually occupational attainment, because this is actually one that people often refer to as a structural kind of force within society, if immigrants can actually move upwardly through a career path. And one thing that we have to keep in mind, that the previous data that I was lacking in the previous disruption and adaptation pieces, were the fact that we only had a very short time frame, and we only looked at one generation. We only looked at the first generation immigrants. And if we want to keep the kind of broader, larger view of immigrant integration, we do need to look at second generation as well. And so at this facilitation stage, I want to actually bring in that second generation piece to see if there's actually a role that religion, again, may be facilitating or perhaps not facilitating their integration into society. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's really two variables that often appear in these surveys. Religious affiliation, what religion are you, and then what levels of religious participation in an organization is occurring. And so this leads us kind of to two kind of contextually based hypotheses that we can work with. One is based on religious affiliation or religious boundary configurations. Unlike before, where I found similarities across contexts, United States, Canada, Europe, I'm now going into a place where we actually would expect differences to occur based on the national context in which these immigrants are coming into. And one of these is based on religious boundary configurations. The idea here is the fact that not every context is the same religiously in which immigrants are moving into, and therefore perhaps may provide them different ways or different levels of facilitation of religion on their immigrant integration. If I could just for a moment leave Canada just to the side and give you a kind of an example that gives kind of a more polar extreme. The United States, for example, is a country that has had a historical relationship of the church and state as being very separate. That does not mean the United States is not a very religious society, but when it comes to legally, the separation of church and state has always been very distinguished. And also, there's been this kind of idea that as new immigrant groups have come in, they have contributed to the religious pluralism within that society. That doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes social discrimination for different religious groups and so forth, but there is this kind of history of religious pluralism there. If we look to many countries in Europe, however, we can see the fact that there has been this historical tie between the state and religion for many countries. There's often a state religion for given countries. Sometimes there's actually taxes given to religious groups as commanded by the state. And so these two kind of contexts show how very different the religious boundaries are for these two different places. I would posit actually that Canada kind of stands somewhere in the middle on this frame. There is certainly a separation of church and state, separation of religion and state, but there's also been a very historical relationship between religion and government services and so forth, not in recent years perhaps, but more historically. And so we would actually expect perhaps Canada to lie somewhere in between these two kind of opposite contexts. And so the idea here is that when there are locations or contexts where there are bright boundaries of religion, that this could provide, especially for religious minorities, barriers for upward mobility. Religion in this way is treated more as an ethnic marker or an attribute, rather than a regardless of a religious practice, per se. We're going to look at religious practice in a moment. There has been evidence of this with some social experiments in Europe of religious minority exclusion, net of other factors. So there is a body of literature that has looked at this, but not really statistically, looking at quantitatively this question. So where bright religious boundaries exist within a receiving society, religious minority majority status has a negative or positive impact on structural integration, such as occupational attainment, which we'll be looking at here, for both first and second generation, net of other relevant factors. So this would be the hypothesis that we'll be testing in the analyses. The other aspect is dealing with religious participation here. And every context, as we've already found, are not the same when it comes to religious participation levels of the native born and so forth. But there's also historical reasons to look at how these religious field characteristics are very different. For example, if I can again use the U.S. and the European examples, the U.S. has many elements of civil society in the United States happens through religious organizations. This is very common. There are certainly other elements of non-religious civil society, but religion is very much at the center of civil society in that context. And it has a lot to do with its history, voluntary participation, congregationalism, what have you. But in Europe, we have certainly seen more of a parish model of religion, in which there isn't necessarily that religion is the center of civil society. And therefore, the religious fields are very different. Here again, I would posit, if I can, at the moment, to put Canada somewhere in the middle. There is certainly this kind of voluntary congregationalism that existed for a long time historically, but at the same time, we know that the levels of religious participation in Canada are much less than the United States, but perhaps not as secular or as low as they would be in Europe. So it does stand somewhere in the middle. And so how does this actually affect, these kind of contexts affect immigrant religion on their integration? Well, certainly religion can provide a lot of resources for immigrants. By being religiously involved in a church or mosque or temple and so forth, they have greater access perhaps to complementary education activities, job market assistance, and also the idea of bridging social capital. They have greater resource networks to rely on, to be able to use in times of unemployment or perhaps looking for a job, or perhaps gaining information on finding a job. All these aspects can happen within religious organizations. But the causal mechanism here that I'm examining is triggered if religious field includes a more voluntary participation or congregationalism. In those contexts, like the United States, and perhaps less so in Canada, but certainly less so in Europe, where there is actually this kind of religious participation element operating, that is where it might be triggered that religious participation might actually facilitate immigrant integration. And I don't want to get into segmented assimilation too deeply because this is a very, there's a lot of literature on this topic. But needless to say that basically there are different paths for first and second generation immigrants dependent on a lot of factors. And we would actually expect that second generation immigrants who have had their whole lives to be able to adapt to this particular context would be more likely to actually use perhaps religious participation to give them that kind of boost for immigrant integration outcomes. So the hypothesis here is that where a congregational religious field exists within a receiving society, religious participation has positive impacts on structural integration, such as occupational attainment, which we'll be looking at today, and especially for second generation, net of other relevant factors. The data I'll be employing here is the Ethnic Diversity Survey, done in 2002. Now this is essentially, as I understand it, an oversample of visible minorities within Canada following the 2001 census. So by the very nature of doing that, we have a great number of first-generation and second-generation immigrants. But we also have a strong native-born population in which to do comparisons. I've limited this to employed respondents, aged 25 to 64. And the variables we'll be looking at here, and it's a dependent variable, we'll be looking at occupation. I basically collapsed the occupation variable into a professional kind of managerial set of occupations versus everyone else. Just for the element of simplicity. I didn't want to get into multinomial regression at this point, but we can talk to that later if you wish. And I also looked at religious affiliation. Again, that's being able to look at those religious boundary differences by different religious group. We also look at religious participation rates as influencing or being, I should say, correlated with occupational attainment. And then we have control variables, parents' education, the education of the respondent themselves, sex, age, marital status, visible minority status, and even the census metropolitan area in which they live. Methods here we'll be using is multivariate logistic regression estimation. Religion here in the first part, we'll be looking at how religion may mediate differences between the native and the immigrants. So the question here is, are immigrants qualitatively different or quantitatively different, I should say, from the native-born in their occupational attainment? And does religion help to understand those differences? The second set of analyses will actually look at immigrant generations on their own to determine if there actually is a relationship between religious participation, religious affiliation, and immigrants per se. So again, I provide these results of Canada against the context of the United States and Western Europe. But first, let's dig into the Canadian experience here. So we can see that compared to the native-born, that first-generation immigrants are less likely to be in a higher occupation. That probably comes with no surprise, even when we control for education and a variety of factors. However, when we look at in the second model, in the green box, we can see here essentially that when we add these religion variables, both religious affiliation and religious attendance or participation, that really the coefficient of negative 0.34 for the first generation changes very little, just changes to minus 0.30. This is indicating that there's really very little activity happening here in mediating the differences in occupational attainment between the first generation and the reference group of the native-born. The second generation immigrant are more or less the same levels of occupational attainment as the native-born, so there really is not much to speak of here at the moment. Now, these coefficients for religious groups and religious attendance are for the general sample, right? Includes both first, second generation, and native-born. I don't want to narrow in on those too much right now because they aren't specifically for a particular generation, but generally we can see that non-Protestant, non-Catholic groups are actually less likely to be in a higher occupation than those that are unaffiliated with no religious group at all. We chose that particular piece because it's the unaffiliated is the reference category because it's the most consistent category across all the contexts that we're looking at here at this moment. If we kind of just take a look at, just to move forward in lieu of time, to the actual individual equations estimated for the first generation and the second generation on their own, we can see that first-generation immigrants, compared to the religiously unaffiliated first-generation immigrants, Christian Orthodox, Muslim, as well as other religions that aren't capitalized here, mostly Sikhs in this regard, are actually less likely to be in a higher occupation than those that are religiously unaffiliated, controlling for a number of factors. We can see also, though, that religious participation has a bearing. We didn't really hypothesize this, but there's actually a negative relationship in first generation of religious participation on occupational attainment. But more important here is to look at the second generation, when we do see here a positive relationship. Those that are attending monthly or more are actually more likely to be in a higher occupation. Again, these are cross-sectional data, so we cannot really see how the directional arrow is going. We cannot necessarily evaluate over time, but this kind of gives us some interesting ideas of what is occurring, of the relationship between religion and occupational attainment. One important thing to kind of look at, again, is to be able to determine if this is kind of a uniquely Canadian experience. And we can see in the United States, as we would have thought, that in the second-generation immigrants, although it's mildly significant, and there's a very low N here of only 350, that there is this positive relationship between religious participation and occupational attainment, looking at the same variables. But when we look at Europe, we can see that Muslims in the first generation are less likely to be in a higher occupation, controlling for other factors related to the unaffiliated, and that religious participation is actually negative socially associated with occupational attainment in the first generation. And interestingly enough, we see no relationship in the second generation of religious participation on occupational attainments, which is, again, what we would expect because the religious field there is not the same that it might be in the United States and perhaps even in Canada. So as a quick summary, we looked at three aspects of kind of the immigrant kind of experience. Moving from country of origin, country of destination, we see that immigrant religious participation is lower after migration. We see that in multiple contexts, not just in Canada. Adaptation, immigrant religious participation starts to resemble local religious participation rates over time. We saw that in a very short time period at local levels in Canada, but we also saw a similar effect in cross-sectional data in the United States and Europe. And finally, we looked at the idea of facilitation, or religion as an independent variable. First-generation religious minorities appear to experience occupational penalties in these cross-sectional data, but religious participation is associated with occupational mobility for the second generation, at least in the Canadian experience. Some theoretical implications here. Quantitatively, certainly this gives some evidence for patterns of immigrant religion in Canada, so I hope that contributes to the discussion. Again, we're kind of bringing some quantitative data to this topic. Disruption and adaptation patterns in immigrant religion are similar to other immigrant outcomes. We would expect this in economic and health and so forth, so this kind of follows the general pattern that religion is perhaps not so different in some ways as other outcomes for immigrants. And lastly, here's a kind of a puzzling kind of thing that we can kind of think through together. If we know from this research that immigrants are adjusting to lower levels of religious participation in areas where the native-born population is not as active in their religious congregations, but yet in the second generation they experience an integration boost related to religious participation, then we would expect immigrants living in less religious areas who will perhaps naturally assimilate or perhaps adjust to the religious participation in their area, not be able to actually experience that integration assistance that might exist through religion because they're adjusting to that levels of religious participation and so forth. So they may not have the same level of mobility as those living in more religious areas, perhaps. That's just something to kind of think about. I have nothing to really formal models to test this through, but that's something just to kind of perhaps think. Now some limitations and further research here. This data is getting old. I do confess that. And so longitudinal survey of immigrants is now approaching, I guess, 7 years since the most recent wave. And also, certainly the Quebec data that I use is older. So things can be changing for sure, and there's greater numbers of second-generation immigrants now becoming adults since that data was taken, so there could be changes. We certainly need more longitudinal data analysis. The ENI and the ALSEC are very short time spans, so it's very difficult for us to always put a causal direction to the results. religious affiliation and participation are just one aspect of immigrant religion. There's certainly the ideas of religious identity and self-rated religiosity and religious volunteerism. There's all kinds of other measures that we could look at, especially for individual religious groups, of how that might vary across religious groups. And analyses do not always permit differences by religious group or religious denominations, because you get into problems of small n and smaller groups to be able to evaluate that efficiently. So that's also an issue. Well, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully I stayed on time today. I think so, right about. And I look forward to taking your questions. Now, I should add that one thing that's pretty unique about the Pew Research Center is that we present facts, and we do not necessarily provide policy implications. So I cannot speak today to kind of policy implications and what the state should do and those type of things. I'm happy to just kind of get through the data some more, but we do leave that as an organization to the policymakers themselves to do. So I can't really answer those kind of questions as we move forward, but if you have questions on the data or questions on the actual research or perhaps other research that you might want to ask me about that I may have done, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe. Excellent timing. Le temps était tout à fait respecté. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a des questions pour Philippe? Est-ce qu'il y en aurait à McGill ou à Laval?
On n'a pas de questions à l'Université Laval, mais on remercie M. Connor pour l'excellente conférence.
Il y en a une ici, donc on va tout de suite aller.
I recall that in that particular longitudinal study, a number of people dropped out of the sample at rather high rates. And I was wondering, like what is the rate that you had when you had this diagram, especially I think the third or fourth slide, the cluster bar charts at the beginning, whether yes, here, what were the ends, the number of people, and whether these were, a big proportion of the sample or a smaller one?
Yes. This is for the Quebec survey you're speaking of, or the? Yeah. This is really, of course, ran into the issue of the Protestant piece here, which it was really hard to evaluate the significant differences because we got into such small ends for there. I confess it's been a while since I've looked at this data, but I believe that we were still, at least for the full sample, of course we had, I think there was at least we had half, at least 500 when we got to, I think the second wave. I can't recall exactly.
100 for all the groups together, or?
Yeah, for all the groups together. So then when we get individual religious groups, that really starts to break down.
That makes it very small.
Yes, and that's why I would point you more to the full sample as opposed to the individual religious groups. But there's still significant differences. I did test just to make sure that there was actually no withdrawal differences between those that left the survey on religious participation. There was no significant differences among those that stayed and or those that left. So that, both in just a basic logistic regression and then those with controls. So at least there didn't seem to be any pattern of religious participation of those that had left the survey over those that had not. In the NIS, that's not so much a problem because it's just one wave. But yeah.
May I?
Yeah, definitely.
Follow up on one more question. Yeah, I'm very interested in some of the issues of the policy implication. I know you don't want to talk about that, but that there is a methodological consequence for that. I'm interested in particular in studying religious dimension of integration when it comes to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And there, I think I would like to know what you think about it. That central tendency is not the relevant thing to look at, because there is a very deep polarization within the groups. And the polarization reflects a polarization in the religion as it is practiced in the countries of origin. And I believe that what matters now is how the various trends within one religious groups evolve and their view integration and so on, because that is getting to become extremely relevant, much more than what people do on the average. You had two hypotheses at the very beginning. You had two explanations, I think the first slide or so. And
on the economic outcomes of...
Yeah,
yes, okay.
And I believe, maybe the first or second slide, you had like two basic hypotheses. And I believe that it's not that important. In other words, both trends can exist. They can be very strong because they are polarized and they have different consequences. And I was just wondering whether, what you think about this.
So I would point you to one other study that I have done that I didn't include here for a matter of time, in which I did look at this question in Europe because the data was somewhat available. So again, I took an immigrant subsample of immigrant Muslims in Europe from the European Social Survey, and actually looked at the religious participation compared to, or try to see the correlation between that and actual levels of immigrant, perceptions of immigrants in local areas. So to be able to see simultaneously, are immigrant Muslims in Europe adjusting to the religious participation rates of the native-born? And I found actually when we start subdividing that, they do come out as very different from the full sample. Okay, so that's kind of the first point. The second point is that, well, part of the explanation for this, not entirely, statistically, it doesn't explain all the variation, but I forget there's one of a significant portion that can be partially explained by the levels of immigrant perceptions of the native-born, not on Muslims per se, but just on immigrants, period. And so basically I looked at the immigrant perception questions. Are immigrants good or bad for the country? Do immigrants undermine culture or enrich culture? Are they worse or bad for the economy? Or worse or bad or good for the economy? Being able to look at these kind of scales. And essentially, immigrant Muslims in Europe at the local level are more religious in those contexts where the general population is more hostile towards immigrants. So there does seem to be some kind of, and again, this is cross-sectional data, so we can't really see. It could go the other way. That could be part of it. As immigrant Muslims become more active, perhaps there is a greater sentiment. So the challenge, again, with all of this data is to be able to have a longer time frame to be able to evaluate this. But I do point you to that piece as being kind of part of the story that I was unable to include here for reasons of time. Thank you.
Moi aussi, je voulais remercier. C'était fort intéressant, très fouillé, très. Je peux parler en français,
oui,
vous m'avez dit.
Oui.
Alors, moi,
je ne comprends pas, je vais demander.
D'accord, on va essayer de faire comme comment il s'appelle, Sugar Sammy. En tout cas, je suis plus à l'aise en français, mais bon,
oui,
on va se. Oui. Moi, je me demandais, je vous ai déjà dit, je travaille surtout sur la deuxième génération et leur intégration en temps apparent dans la société d'accueil. Et je me demandais, moi, dans mes données, je trouve souvent une très grande différence entre les différents groupes. Moi, je trouve surtout l'appartenance aux différents groupes de minorités visibles comme grand impact sur, oui, le taux d'activité, oui, la réussite scolaire, tous les aspects d'une réussite du projet d'immigration de la première génération, finalement. Et dans vos données, je me demandais, j'ai vu que quelque part vous aviez d'autres variables d'appartenance sociale comme variables de contrôle, mais je me souviens plus à quel niveau. Est-ce que vous pensez que d'autres appartenances que religieuses peuvent peut-être avoir un impact conjoint ou potentiellement explicateur de cet impact de l'appartenance religieuse, comme par exemple l'appartenance à une minorité visible. Parce que souvent, c'est couplé, même si c'est, moi je travaille avec les données du recensement, malheureusement, toutes les données datent, et je trouve ça courageux de s'y consacrer aussi longtemps. Mais donc il y a est-ce que vous pensez qu'il pourrait y avoir une corrélation de différentes appartenances pour expliquer l'impact de l'appartenance religieuse à ce diplôme.
So one of the things that we, and I say we here, the latter part of my presentation, and I forgot to mention this, and now this is a good time for me to do it, is the facilitation piece is a co-authored paper with Matthias Koenig, as I mentioned at the beginning, at University of Göttingen. And one of the important things that we wanted to disaggregate in this analysis was to look at religious differences net of ethnic differences, to be able to see that when we actually control for visible minority status, to be able to see the different ethnic groups, does there still remain some kind of religious difference? And this is what we found in Canada to be true, that there are immigrant religious differences compared to the religiously unaffiliated, those that have no religion. There is this kind of negative relationship on occupational attainment. Do keep in mind that these results are also for adults, second generation. And so there's certainly 25 actually or higher. One additional analysis that we did is to look at the differences between Quebec and English Canada, because we thought there might be actually some differences on this matter. But we did not find very many, that the same kind of general pattern that I've pointed to here exists both in Quebec and English Canada. Particularly interesting, which was somewhat surprising to me personally, was the fact that second-generation immigrants in Quebec who were participating regularly, regardless of religious group, in a religious organization, had a higher probability of occupational attainment, which is something that perhaps, thinking of Quebec versus English Canada, perhaps being less religiously active, at least by statistical measures, was interesting. So I'm not sure if I exactly have answered your question, but we did want to try to figure out net of visible minority status and all these other pieces. And we've done some additional, or I've done some additional research looking at some different interactions, if you will, or looking at some different things. So I'd be glad to talk with you after and be able to tease those out. I just didn't want to provide so many numbers here that people were going to go a bit crazy. I couldn't understand.
Hello? Could I make a question? Yes, no, I think it's very interesting what you just presented. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea that, I mean, you have, for example, in terms of living arrangements in the U.S., you could argue that it's either acculturation, and the extent of extended household is a matter of acculturation or just like economic need. And so I'm just wondering if you told us a story mainly about acculturation and adaptation and disruption, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit of, I mean, maybe after 2 years after arriving here, immigrants just need to find a job, they're working, they are just like, there are other needs that need to be fulfilled. And so I was wondering if you explored these other like alternative hypotheses of what else they were doing that could actually made it impossible for them on a Sunday to go to a mass because they are working on a Sunday. So that's one thing. And the other thing is like, what happens once they are settled, like let's say 10 years afterwards? Like, is there research showing that, I mean, because I would also expect what you said of this bounding up, but I mean, I have the impression that 2 years, it's kind of just like a very short period. So
Sure.
Could you comment on that, please?
Sure, thanks for the question. This is very important because, again, I didn't go to the 10-year wave, and also because there was in the Quebec data, there was a lot of missing, and there was a lot of missing respondents by the 10-year wave, so it's also contributed to why I couldn't use that 10-year wave. I can only speak to this particular question with my own research statistically with the United States, if I may. So we would expect perhaps that immigrants, especially in the United States, would rebound their religious participation after a long time living in the United States. Fairly religious society, and that disruption perhaps would wear off over time. Interestingly enough, in this new immigrant survey, which I've used, this is actually a cohort of immigrants who received permanent residency in 2003. About half of them adjusted to permanent resident status, which means they were already living in the United States. They were not coming from abroad. They were adjusting from some other visa, whether it be a work visa, perhaps they were once illegal and now were becoming legalized. So some of them had lived in the United States for 10, 20 years in a variety of different visa statuses. And so what I did do is separate the equations by these kind of broader time durations of groups. And even those that had lived in 10 years or more in the United States still had a lower level of religious participation as recorded by their own self-measure. You have to keep this in mind. Retrospectively, they're thinking back before they came to the United States, which could have been 10 or 20 years ago, that they, on the average, were less actively religious than they were in their country of origin. Even that group was. So that indicates to me that there is this kind of disruption on the whole. And again, this is very broad. Their individuals will be different among themselves, but on the average, it does appear that, at least in that data set, that was the case. In terms of the shorter time frame and the control variables that I could employ there to be able to see that, I do include a lot of socio-demographic variables, but that's an interesting point that I should probably go back to. I do include whether they were employed or not in terms of activity, their main activity as recorded by the survey. But that's a good point. I will go back to that and check that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
You didn't present this in your presentation today, but just to follow up on your point, and you answered that you had compared Quebec and the rest of Canada to see whether there were differences. Mm-hmm. Did you control or check for linguistic
ability of the immigrant themselves in French or English?
Yes, whether they were like towards French, integrating into the French society, or what language, for instance, they were using at home.
Yes.
Whether English speaking or French speaking.
Yes. So yes, precisely.
Not at home, but at least at work. I don't know.
Right. Right. Yeah, we did take that into account when we looked at the Quebec English differences. And yes, in the English Canada, we recorded if they, of course, were speaking English at home primarily or not. And then in Quebec, it was French capacity, French in the home. I can't remember. Was it French in the home where they actually had, I think that's what it was, because we didn't have an independent measure of the level of English they felt they could. So, right, yeah. But we did control for what language was primarily spoken in the home as kind of an indicator of that. So yes, there could be certainly some other factors there, but we did think of it, put it into account.
I have one question.
Okay.
Would that be possible, given the current trends in migration flows, that these people come from countries that are, most of them, more religious than the countries they go to? And there would be, for some of them, a selection process of those who would prefer to live in a freer environment, religious environment. So the decline could be simply a consequence, partially a consequence of that kind of process.
Yes, that could be possible. I think we were still at Pew trying to figure out some of these comparisons of the country of origin levels of religiosity and then in the country of destination. We're actually working on that globally. So right now we're actually working on trying to determine what is the level of religious participation in every country of the world and so forth. And so we're still grappling with that. That could be part of the story. I would think, though, however, that it seems to me that immigrants are not typically selecting themselves by religious characteristics, especially maybe by religious affiliation, because that as often is connected to country of origin and some of the legal barriers that might exist for some groups to come into and educationally. But I don't think they're necessarily selecting by, the majority of immigrants anyway, by their levels of religious participation of where they go to. But that could be operating here. I think what's interesting, though, is the fact that we see it in two very different contexts, both in Quebec and the United States. I think if that were not the case, and we saw different results, then perhaps a selection argument could be made. But the similarity of those two very dissimilar contexts helps to bring to my mind anyway that selection may not be as operating as much as we may think.
Are there other phenomena, and here I'm thinking of fertility, where we could see some kind of adjustment pattern because we know that immigrants, they tend after a while to adjust their fertility level
Sure.
to the fertility of the host country.
Sure.
Could there be some similarity with other phenomena where you could also use some of the approaches that?
Yes, if I had more data. So yeah, that is part of the theory that or the hypothesis that I've built here is fertility is one of them, to compare the fact that we do see this drop in fertility, and often it's because of practical reasons. The fact you have spouses who are now living in two different countries and adjusting to economic life and, you know, putting off their child rearing at childbirth. But I would be really glad, yes, to look at those processes when more data becomes available. We'll, as I said, with the new immigrant survey for the United States, with this next wave, we'll be able to, again, be able to see this kind of pattern of immigrant religious adaptation at a local state level, similar to what I did in the LSIC, but this will be about 5 or 6 years after the first wave. So that gives kind of a little more time to allow for that potential disruption phase to have finished and then to move on to there. So we're looking forward to getting that data and doing that.
Il y a d'autres questions ici ou à McGill ou à Laval?
Non, pas à McGill. Merci pour la conférence, par exemple.
Merci beaucoup.
Alors, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, je crois qu'il nous reste à conclure en remerciant notre invité. Donc, merci beaucoup, Philippe, pour cette excellente présentation. Puis, c'était des belles questions, des bonnes discussions.
Oui.
Donc, et on se revoit à un autre séminaire. Merci à tout le monde.
Merci.